Welcome back, APUSH students. Today is chapter 36 of the American Pageant, titled American Zenith. If you don't know the American Pageant, it's fine because the content is still going to be the same. I'm going to be going over all the key terms and notes for this chapter to help me get a 5, so I encourage you to take notes along as well. Quick note before the rest of the video, this chapter is extremely long. There's a lot of key terms, so I'm going to try and keep it as short as possible. I'm going to just read what I have on the slides and try to cut out all the filler stuff because you guys don't want to be here for a half hour, and I don't want these videos to be that long. They're supposed to be quick study videos, so I'm just going to keep it short and to the point. So let's get to it. White collar work, service work, office work are traditionally more professional jobs. In the post-war era, white collar workers outnumber blue collar workers, symbolizing the expansion and shift of the American economy to service work. In correlation, blue collar work took a step back and union representation declined. White collar work influenced culture as a surge in successful men gave way to many women returning to the domestic front after the war's end. The expansion of white collar work is a reason why things like a college degree are becoming more and more necessary in the United States. The Feminine Mystique, best-selling book on women, it was a part of the greater feminist movement that influenced modern feminism/women's movement. It touched on the limitations of the domestic front for women and encouraged women to explore the world. The piece of literature had an enormous outreach to all demographics of women. Growth of television, TV being available in all American households. The growth of the TV set created a fundamental shift in entertainment as advertisers and producers focused their attention on television. The TV became a center for American culture as social, moral, and political teachings were taught and challenged over the television. The TV also became sort of its own economy as well. Rock and roll, music crossing between traditional black and white music. The music genre traversed cultural divisions and brought together black and white. It especially took hold in the younger generation as it was a symbol of tolerance and the breaking of racial barriers in that generation as a whole. So this is how the civil rights movement kind of works its way into culture. The Lonely Crowd, The Organization Man, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, books fearing the post-war generation. The literature brought up valid criticisms of the consumerist lifestyle and dramatic shift of moral and sexual standards in the post-war generation. Their predictions on consumer conformity and the conflation of private activity versus public activity, specifically in regard to sexual behavior, were valid and true. These books symbolize how traditional thinkers challenged the modernist culture. So it's interesting how the boomer generation, who are seen as cynical and traditional, were actually the progressives back in this day. Dwight Eisenhower, Republican candidate and eventual president. He was popular as a war hero and a politician. To some, he was a symbol of bipartisanship and American values. Due to his personality, much of his campaigning was left to his boisterous Vice President Nixon, who was the same Richard Nixon as everyone knows, who was anti-communist and a red hunter. Eisenhower pledged to be tough on the Korean War, which signed his leadership and ability to put America over partisan divides, but his over-attention to how others felt about him prevented him from taking meaningful action on any front, especially civil rights. Checker's speech, Nixon's speech defending against illegal donation allegations. It was a poor speech that displayed his lack of responsibility or shame for his situation, which foreshadowed what eventually happened to Nixon, but nonetheless it won over the American people. Its great outreach through the television displayed how the TV was becoming a political tool through direct-to-voter appeal and access to the people. Emmett Till, young African-American boy who was lynched. He became a famous symbol for protesting against black violence in the racist South. His stories showed the still dangerous society blacks lived in despite emancipation and any progress made since, and that Jim Crow needed to be fought. He became yet another symbol of the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks, black activist who refused to go per se on a bus. Her arrest after the incident inspired a bus boycott in Alabama that symbolized the growing spirit among African Americans that they would not submit to the absurdities of Jim Crow segregation. Montgomery bus boycott of the bus system in Alabama. The boycott forced the government's hand to pass laws for more equality and inspired other boycott movements against segregation. Specifically, NAACP involvement in Alabama allowed MLK to come to the forefront of the civil rights movement. I don't know why I said NAACP, it's NAACP as it's commonly known. Brown v. Board of Education, ruling that school segregation was unconstitutional. This is a major case if anyone's in AP government. It stated that separate but equal segregation was illegal, which sparked mass desegregation in all areas of American life. It was a landmark case that finally acknowledged the true injustices of segregation, although it took time to take hold in the deep Jim Crow South. This overturned the old 1890s case of Plessy v. Ferguson, which upheld segregation. Little Rock Central High crisis, National Guard preventing black students going to school in Arkansas. This clear violation of desegregation and challenge to federal power made Eisenhower respond by sending troops to protect the students and allow them to go to school. This situation showed how the federal government was assuming the authority to go over Jim Crow states not complying with civil rights legislation. So you can see the rifts between the South and the federal government still exist over Jim Crow and racism. SNCC, committee focused on nonviolent civil rights protests. It was created in response to the growing popularity of sit-ins and other protests demanding racial equality. This organization allowed for more direct efforts and protests, and it was filled with passionate young folk that took heavy action. Operation Wetback cracked down on illegal immigrants. Many illegals are rounded up and returned to Mexico. This was an example of Eisenhower taking heavy action on a controversial issue, this time siding with conservatives. One positive goal was restoring the value of the Bracero program for Mexican workers established many years before. Federal Highway Act of 1956, also called Interstate Highway Act, it constructed large national highways. It was advertised as a Cold War project that would help military mobilization, but its eventual economic effects on job creation and influence on suburbanization were more long-lasting and more accurate to the legacy of highways. It spiked the automobile and trucking industries and also inspired the creation of more stores and consumer centers. Its downsides were lowering the importance of railroads and trains and creating more carbon emissions. John Foster Dulles, aggressive Secretary of State, he wanted a more anti-communist foreign policy focusing on ridding the world of red and liberating people under communist rule. Interestingly, he also wanted to cut defense spending and reduce the budget overall, which created many challenges in how Eisenhower administration would approach his aggressive goals. Policy of boldness, reduction of traditional military, and expansion in nuclear weaponry. The move for more destructive and nuclear weapons represent the full-scale aggressiveness during the Cold War and how nuclear threats were being used over traditional military threats. This policy symbolized how conflict and the basis of the military was shifted after new technology like nuclear weapons became popularized. Hungarian revolution against Soviet rule that failed. After the Americans refused to give aid to the uprising, it was crushed by the Soviets and no progress was made. It showed that aggressive nuclear policy was not a viable solution to the Cold War because it could not help minor issues like small-scale revolutions, as a nuclear bomb wouldn't be logical in any situation. The bold policy was exposed for having limitations on military policy. This is one of the reasons why nuclear war never broke out, because it was never really sensible to ever use a nuclear weapon. Ho Chi Minh, leader of the communist North Vietnam, this is where the Vietnam War stuff starts happening. He led nationalist forces against foreign occupiers that led to the independence of Vietnam, which plunged the country into communism. He was quite popular among the Vietnam people, who unfortunately widely supported the communists. Viet Minh, Communist Party in Vietnam. It was the popular and ruling party of North Vietnam as a communist state, which was opposed to South Vietnam and any support by the United States in South Vietnam. The Viet Minh was for Vietnamese autonomy and independence from foreign influence. Battle of Dien Bien Phu, communist victory in Vietnam. When America failed once again to act on its bold policy, the communists won and took over. North Vietnam was subjected to communist rule, while South Vietnam was established as Western-friendly with America as allies, although South Vietnam was not popular and communist resistance in the South grew in popularity. Suez Crisis, Egyptian nationalists taking over Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was vital in ensuring the oil supply for Europe, and it violated British and French sovereignty since they collectively owned the canal via stock holdings. The crisis exposed that the US was no longer independent when it came to oil supply, and that the Middle East would prove to be of dramatic importance for the Western powers. So because the US and a lot of the West relied on the Middle East, any crisis happening over there would be absolutely detrimental to their oil supply. OPEC, foreign committee consisting of oil-producing countries. The organization challenged Western and specifically American authority on the world's oil supply. Due to this organization, the Western powers were forced to cooperate with the Middle East and not continue their almost dictatorial control in the oil region. Sputnik 1, Soviet satellite launched into space. It was the first artificial object that was launched into orbit, and it shattered American ego and their ability to keep up with Soviet technology. The threat of the Soviets dominating space militarily prompted the space race, where America greatly ramped up technological advancements and also increased Cold War tensions. Eventually, the space race sent Americans to the moon. Cuban Revolution, dictator Fidel Castro takes over Cuba. Castro was very anti-America and installed an anti-American regime. He took away land owned by Americans and redistributed to citizens friendly with his regime. The most threatening consequence was that Castro was friendly with Russia, and they became almost a satellite state for the Soviets. This leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kitchen debate between Nixon and Khrushchev, who's the leader of the Soviet Union. Nixon proudly displayed American capitalist successes over left-wing Soviet economics, which portrayed American strength and instilled confidence in Nixon. This debate and show for the American people was critical in Nixon being given the Republican nomination. John F. Kennedy, Democratic primary nominee and president. Although his Catholic faith created conflict in Southern Democrats, he was otherwise very popular, especially in the North. Kennedy had an appealing figure and behaved well in the public eye, which was key to overtaking Nixon in public opinion and eventually winning the presidency. Military-industrial complex, expanding military and industrial production. As the military and military industry kept expanding, it was becoming a dangerous symbol to the world of militarism between the major world powers in the Cold War. People like Eisenhower feared that defense spending could become wasteful and would have negative impacts on the economy. You'll hear a lot of people whenever violence breaks out, they blame the military-industrial complex, which in a lot of ways is definitely true, but whether expanding the military is bad or not is definitely a debate that will continue. Beat generation, writers against American culture. They created literature that was part of the growing counterculture, one that rejected American consumerism and conformity and preached self-expression. These writers wrote about the challenges of post-war modernism. Jack Kerouac, Beat generation writer. He was known, along with a few others, as a pioneer of the post-war Beat generation. His writings opened the world to a new perspective on American life and how self-identification and expression took importance in society. New Frontier, Kennedy's dream for the young generation. He developed the idea that America had a destiny of greatness and that it was in the hands of young people to move America forward. He followed the path of modernism and how younger Americans were the direction of the country. Peace Corps, Peaceful American Army. It was made up of moral and idealistic people who were sent to help underserved communities. This group helped to restore the ideas of America promoting freedom over the very militaristic decades after World War II. These people prompted Americans to serve others before they served themselves. Apollo missions, NASA missions to land on the moon. After much investment, much progress, and many tries, Americans finally landed a crew on the moon and planted the American flag. More important than scientific discoveries, America reinstated its world dominance after the ego-leveling Sputnik situation. America once again displayed its power on the international stage, and serious questions about the future of space were raised. Space as sort of a military sphere definitely came up as an idea back then. We're still now not really sure how space will be used militarily, but it all dates back to the first landing on the moon. Berlin Wall, wall between East and West Berlin. Not only was it a barrier between East and West Berlin, keeping families separated and populations confined, but it became a broader symbol of Soviet communist oppression. It symbolized the division of Europe into divisive camps, one capitalist and one communist. The Berlin Wall was an ugly symbol to the world. European Economic Community, free trade area. It helped to keep the post-war European economies active and eventually return to prosperity. This community of European powers eventually turned into the EU. Tariffs were cut in Western Europe and the US to promote trade and economic activity, laws that became the foundation for economic globalization. Flexible response, plan that gave many options depending on crisis. The plan made sure that the Cold War tensions would not lead to overreactions in order to not overblow any event into warfare or nuclear battles. This encouraged the US to continue its standard militarization over creating a force dependent on nuclear technology, which led to guerrilla proxy wars over nuclear exchanges. Cuban Missile Crisis, Soviet missiles spotted in Cuba. This event was the pinnacle of Cold War tensions, as many believed nuclear warfare would soon follow. The American and Soviet navies surrounded Cuba, each with orders to retaliate if they were attacked. Eventually it was solved when America agreed to remove missiles from Turkey and the Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba, and America agreed to pull out of Cuba. The fallout led to rapid Soviet militarization to rid themselves of humiliation, but also eventual peaceful policies. Many accounts from this day will say that people even thought the world would end that day. Freedom Riders, civil rights protesters of segregated buses. This group took direct action by driving desegregated buses through the Deep South, both challenging the authorities to enforce segregation and exposing the absurd policies of Jim Crow. Freedom Riders were met with racist violence that had to be quelled federally as Southern governments refused to aid the protesters. Voter Education Project, program to register black voters. It increased the level of participation and voices for the black community in government, which in turn supported civil rights legislation and candidates. Birmingham, Alabama, most segregated and most civil rights active city. This is where MLK really took the civil rights movement to the top. Civil rights leaders like MLK put direct focus on the city and launched powerful campaigns against segregation and violence. When their peaceful protests were violently repelled, it forced the president to side with civil rights. March on Washington, civil rights protest led by MLK. It was one of the largest and most peaceful civil rights demonstrations. The speech that followed became one of the most famous American orations of all time, the I Have a Dream speech. This event became the capstone of the civil rights movement and finally gave way to JFK signing the Civil Rights Bill. JFK's assassination, Kennedy being shot in Texas. It was one of the greatest American tragedies in history. The nation grieved and also quickly turned to theories and speculation that have never been solved. Sadly, JFK's assassination finally revealed his long-lasting legacy and how his modernist personality took firm hold in all Americans. And that's a wrap. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next chapter, and goodbye.